No one in the mansion dared cross the invisible line between the millionaire's work and privacy, but that morning, something was left behind. Something small, shiny, impossible to ignore. A single earring resting on the expensive sheets, like a secret left in plain sight. He picked it up unhurriedly, feeling the silent metallic weight of the gesture. He knew exactly who it belonged to, and he knew it wasn't just a forgotten object. Before anyone noticed, he crossed the hallway, opened the safe, and with a sharp click, locked away not only the earring but also a part of his own history. That night she noticed its absence. She searched her purse, her room, the laundry room. Nothing. The earring seemed to have vanished. But what tormented her wasn't the piece's value, but the look in his eyes the next day, a discreet, almost imperceptible smile, as if he were hiding an answer no one would dare ask. And without knowing it, she had just lit a fuse that would slowly burn, revealing truths that not even the most secure safe could keep hidden. If this beginning already got you hooked, what comes next will take your breath away. Subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss the sequel. And tell me in the comments, what do you think he's really hiding in that vault? The mansion rose above the hill like a monument to silence. There was no laughter in the hallways, no hurried footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Everything there seemed calculated so that nothing was out. Off place, as if every object held a sacred position and every sound needed to ask permission to exist. Through the enormous glass facade, the sun filtered timidly, scattering golden reflections across the white walls and the stairs with their polished banisters. Upstairs, the millionaire moved like an elegant shadow, always in an impeccable suit, with a distant gaze and a low voice, as if he didn't speak, only decided. Abigail, the new maid, knew her place in this setting. She had arrived at little over 2 weeks ago, and already knew that the mansion tolerated no mistakes. Every surface should shine, every room should exude order, and she should become nearly invisible, like a discreet cog in a vast mechanism. But invisibility didn't mean absence. From the first day she had felt her footsteps were being heard, every movement registered by eyes that didn't allow themselves to be seen for long. The millionaire was rarely present when she passed, but when he was, there was something in the way he averted his gaze, as if he didn't want her to realize she was being watched. The routine continued like this for days, cleaning, organizing, passing through the same rooms, avoiding the few spaces that seemed to have a different, denser atmosphere. There were no explicit orders about where not to enter, but certain spaces had an energy that needed no warning, among them the master bedroom. Not that Abigail hadn't been there, after all it was part of her job, but there was an invisible edge in the air, something in the way the sheets were always perfectly aligned, in the soft scent that blended polished wood and expensive perfume. When she walked through that door, she felt a presence that didn't just come from the walls. The millionaire almost never saw her there, but in the rare moments when he did, his eyes followed her, not with authority, but with something more indefinite, almost curious. Abigail, for her part, maintained her posture. I knew I was there to work, but there was something unsettling in realizing that, behind that impassive face, perhaps there were questions no one dared answer. It was the kind of tension that isn't created by words, but by silences, long, charged silences that hang in the air like a thread about to snap. And though I couldn't know it at the time, that thread was already being pulled, slowly, toward a point of no return. Over the next few days, Abigail began to notice small gestures that didn't fit into the mansion's meticulously predictable routine. A cup of coffee forgotten on the stair railing, a book open on the library chair with slightly crumpled pages, a tie left draped over the arm of the sofa. These were subtle details, but they clashed with the image of perfection the millionaire cultivated. She noticed these signs, and although she picked them up with the naturalness of someone doing their job, she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something deliberate about them, as if, somehow, he wanted to leave traces for them to find. One afternoon, while polishing the silver in the dining room, she heard slow footsteps approaching. It wasn't the butler's steady steps or the shuffling of the other staff's slippers. It was heavy, rhythmic footsteps, as if his presence announced itself before it was even seen. Looking up, she found the millionaire standing in the doorway, one hand resting on the doorframe. He watched her silently without a smile. That look was both appraising and curious, as if trying to discover something even she herself didn't know. "Have you worked on houses like this before?" he asked, his tone so low that the question seemed more like a thought spoken aloud. Abigail said yes, though it wasn't entirely true. He simply nodded and withdrew, leaving the impression that he'd asked the question not to hear the answer, but to gauge her reaction. As the days passed, these brief encounters repeated themselves. She'd run into him in the hallway, and he'd look away as if caught in something he didn't want to admit. Other times, they'd pass each other on the stairs, and he'd hold the railing a little longer than necessary, just to watch her pass. It was as if they were dancing a silent choreography, in which no step was taken by chance. Abigail didn't dare interpret it as interest, but there was a strange warmth in the way the air seemed to shift when they were near. And, like an invisible thread being pulled from both sides, the distance between them began to narrow. Until one cold Monday morning, as she entered the master bedroom to make the bed, she noticed something different. The normally impeccable linen bedspread was slightly wrinkled, and on the pillow there was still the imprint of a body that shouldn't have been there at that hour. For a moment she stood still, just staring, with the feeling that she was facing something that went beyond the limits of her work. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the first clear move in a game that, once started, could not be stopped without consequences. That Wednesday, the mansion was strangely silent, as if emptied of all life, except for the pent-up breathing Abigail felt in her own chest. The millionaire had left early, or so they said. The distant sound of light rain beating against the windows brought a kind of intimacy to the air, as if each room were breathing more slowly. Abigail climbed the stairs with the basket of clean clothes, knowing the master bedroom was on her to-do list that morning. She pushed the door open slowly, almost as if asking permission, and entered. His scent still permeated the room, a precise blend of woody and fresh notes that seemed to survive even in his physical absence. She began to make the bed, carefully straightening the sheet, and as she leaned over to adjust the pillow, she felt the earring slip from her ear. It happened so quickly that the sharp sound of the small piece touching the sheet was almost lost in the air. She held it for a second, hesitant, feeling the cold metal between her fingers. It was a simple earring, but one with sentimental value, a gift from her mother before she left her hometown. Abigail considered putting it back on, but for some reason she couldn't explain, she hesitated. Her eyes roamed the room, fixing on the bedspread, the contrast of the gold against the light fabric. A strange impulse made her leave it there, like someone planting a seed, not knowing what will grow from it. As he left, he turned for one last look. The earring, so small, seemed immense in that space of controlled perfection, almost like an intrusion. He closed the door and continued his routine, but the feeling of having crossed a line lingered. For the rest of the day, Abigail couldn't stop wondering if he would understand. She imagined the moment he would enter the room, see the piece, and try to decipher the reason for its presence. Would it be interpreted as an oversight, a provocation, or something else that even she dared not name? What she didn't know was that a few hours later, he would enter the room, and the first thing his eyes would see would be that very small fragment of gold on the bed, and that the decision he made next would change the silent course of everything between them. The room was, as always, immaculate, silent, bathed in that light filtered through the linen curtains. But as soon as he stepped through the door, he noticed something was out of place. It wasn't the disorder, because there wasn't any, but a detail that clashed with the perfect geometry he cultivated there. On the bed, resting as if it had been left there on purpose, was the earring. Small, delicate, with a soft glow that caught the late afternoon light. He approached slowly, as if unwilling to disrupt the scene unfolding before him. His fingers touched the cold metal, and for an instant his mind was invaded by memories that didn't belong there. Images of another woman, another time, another gaze that had also left behind something so small and yet so full of meaning. The weight of that memory made his jaw tighten. He turned the earring between his fingers, feeling its texture, as if he could decipher something about the wearer just by its touch. And he knew very well who it belonged to. The new maid. Abigail. There was no doubt. What he didn't know, or perhaps he did know but wouldn't admit it, was whether it had been an oversight or a calculated gesture. But the interpretation mattered little. What mattered was what he would do next. He walked to the corner of the room, discreetly opened the door built into the wall, and revealed the safe. The numbers spun with a dry sound, a rhythm he knew by heart. When the steel door swung open, the interior revealed an organized space, but not just by monetary value. There were old photos, letters, small objects that to anyone else would mean nothing, but to him were fragments of stories he dared not revisit. He placed the earring there between a small velvet box and an envelope yellowed with age, and closed the safe with a firm click. It wasn't just an act of keeping, it was a form of holding. He knew that somehow this would create an invisible line between them, a line that could not be undone without one of them bleeding. As he left the room, he carried with him the knowledge that now something of hers was locked away in the most inaccessible place in the house, and that, perhaps, that was exactly where he wanted it. To remain. The next morning, Abigail noticed its absence before she had even finished dressing. Her hand instinctively went to her left ear, finding only emptiness. The memory came to her in a flash. The bedroom, the bed, the earring lying on the sheet. A knot formed in her stomach. She tried to remain calm, but the knowledge that the object wasn't where it should have been began to erode her attention to every task. She began searching the laundry room, going through stacks of freshly washed sheets, carefully running her fingers over the fabric, as if the small metal might magically appear among the fibers. Nothing. She searched the kitchen, the hallway, the laundry basket, even the most unlikely corners, as if the earring had a will of its own and decided to hide. But the truth was already beginning to form in her mind. It wasn't lost. It was in someone's hands, and not just anyone's. As she slipped into the master bedroom to continue her routine, her eyes roamed every surface with concealed attention. She didn't find the earring, but she did find something more disturbing, the feeling that the air was heavier, as if carrying the recent memory of an event she hadn't witnessed. As she changed the water in the flower vase, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced even before he appeared in the doorway. The millionaire entered with the naturalness of someone who owned every inch of that space. He said nothing. He simply stared at her for a few seconds that seemed longer than they were, as if waiting for a reaction, perhaps a confession. Abigail kept her gaze lowered, but she felt him reading every small movement of her hands, every breath she took. The absence of words was worse than any accusation. When he finally withdrew, the sound of his footsteps receding didn't bring relief. It brought certainty. He knew. And somehow he was letting her know he knew. In the days that followed, the search turned into a silent obsession. As she went about her duties, she mentally sifted through the possibilities. Had he thrown it away, kept it? Why? It wasn't just about getting the earring back, but understanding why it was in his hands. And though she had no proof, Abigail began to notice something. Every time their eyes met, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible glow that seemed to tell her the game had begun, and that he was in control of the rules. The days began to slide by like invisible blades, cutting through any possibility of neutrality between them. Not a single word was out of place, but there was a constellation of gestures that, combined, formed something greater than they both pretended not to see. Abigail began to notice that the millionaire always appeared a second before she finished a task, as if calculating the exact moment he would catch her. In the library, when she was lining up the books by height, he would appear leaning against the shelf. In the glass-enclosed hallway, when she closed the last blind, he would already be watching her with his hands in his pockets, his shoulder resting against the doorframe. In the office, when she polished the metal of the lampshade, he would turn off the lights to see only the reflection run across the newly polished shine. None of this required an explanation, and yet everything demanded an answer that never came. One morning she found a half-set chessboard on her desk. The dark pieces dominated the center, and the white queen was too far forward, almost reckless, in danger of capture. As she dusted it off, His voice came from behind, low, cutting through the silence like a blade that doesn't hurt but threatens. "Haste often betrays the best pieces." Abigail nodded, without looking up. The comment wasn't about the game. He passed by close enough for his scent to fill the space between them, and moved a pawn with the tip of his finger, slow, calculated, opening the way for something she couldn't name. It's curious how some things, when they're out of place, make more noise than when they're where they should be, he said, looking not at the tray but at her reflection in the glass. She replied that the house preferred things in order. He smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly. "The house, yes." And he left the room, as if asking a question and taking with him the only key to the answer. At lunchtime, Abigail walked through the side hallway and noticed for the first time the safe door, recessed behind a panel which was millimeters out of alignment. It was just a subtle unevenness, one anyone else would ignore but not her. The cold metal behind the wood seemed to breathe. Her heart raced, and she recoiled instinctively, as if just noticing that detail were rape. That afternoon, the inevitable encounter. He came down the stairs as she ascended with the silver tray. They stopped on the same step, trapped by a geometry that allowed no graceful escape. He looked at the tray, then at her fingers gripping the edge. "Steady hands," he commented, and, the compliment sounded more intimate than it should have. "So as not to drop what's valuable," she returned, not daring to look at him for more than a second. "Sometimes what's valuable is silence," he said, moving just a little closer, enough for her to feel the vibration of his voice more than hear the sentence. The world contracted around that step. For a moment, Abigail imagined the outline of the earring set in dark metal, invisible to all but the owner of the secret. The tray remained. Steady, so did they. When the moment broke, he descended the last flight with the studied naturalness of someone commanding a scene. Upon reaching the ground floor, without turning his head, he uttered the sentence that would alter the mood of the day. "Tonight, smaller dining room, 2 seats." The sentence hung in the air, with no declared recipient, but Abigail sensed it was meant for her. The other employees whispered when they heard about the change. It wasn't common for the boss to use the small room, much less for such a calculated dinner. That night, as she lit the candles and adjusted the cutlery with pinpoint precision, she heard the notes of a piano coming from upstairs, a short snippet of interrupted melody, like a thought that couldn't be completed. The sound drifted down the walls and touched the set table like an invisible hand. She took a deep breath, checked the glasses for the 3rd time, and realized that the chosen wine had an aroma of dark fruits and something metallic, dry, as if the safe itself had signed the label. When she stepped back to assess the composition, she saw her own reflection flicker on the surface of the glass and felt as if she were preparing for a trial. There would be no accusations, no defense. There would be a table, 2 chairs, and a game that had been played long before they admitted it, and as the clock in the room ticked to the exact minute agreed, she understood that when he sat down, nothing would be said clearly. But the subtext would have had enough weight to shift in one fell swoop the very axis of that house. The smaller dining room seemed made for conversations that didn't want witnesses. 2 tall candles, a discreet centerpiece of white flowers, and the restrained shine of silver reflecting the flame in almost imperceptible tremors. Abigail adjusted the last napkin when she heard the door open. He entered unhurriedly, as if measuring the distance between each gesture and the desired effect. He stopped in front of the chair at the head of the table, but didn't sit down. Sit. The word came unadorned, but it didn't sound like an order. It sounded like a risky invitation. She hesitated, eyes on the linen napkin, hands clasped to hide the slight tremor, and then sat, not at the head of the table but opposite, maintaining an invisible line of security between them. He poured wine, raised the glass, and waited. She declined with a barely perceptible nod. "Water," he ordered, and he nodded with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. They ate in silence for the first few minutes, a restrained choreography of cutlery and controlled breathing. The sound of knives on china resembled a grandfather clock no one dared look at. He broke the silence like someone moving the first piece in a game that had already begun, long before the table was set. I like things that stay where I leave them. It didn't feel like a confession. It felt like a thesis. The house sleeps better when nothing is missing. Abigail maintained her posture, but felt the sentence find her left ear with almost physical precision. Sometimes small things get out of place, she replied, measuring the weight of each syllable. And the house takes a while to get the message. He set down his cutlery, folded his hands on the table and studied her for a second too long. Small things often carry big messages. He didn't say any names. He didn't need to. The air between them thickened, like tempered glass about to crack. He stood, went to the sideboard, opened a drawer and took out a narrow leather-bound notebook. He walked around the perimeter of the table twice leisurely, setting the notebook beside Abigail's plate, still closed. "House catalogue," he explained. "I write down what comes in, what goes out. What should never have been here and yet finds a place." She touched the cover with her fingertips without opening it. "Sometimes the right place for something isn't where everyone expects it," he said, his own voice quieter than usual. He leaned in slightly, enough for the candles to cast new shadows on his face. "And sometimes the right place is where no one can reach." The comment seemed to spark behind the walls, the memory of the millimeter panel she'd noticed in the hallway. She looked up, and for a moment they stared at each other undisguisedly, not as employer and employee, but as two accomplices in a crime that still had no name. "I've learned," he continued, "that some objects require time. If you return them too soon, you ruin what they're trying to reveal." The sentence landed on the table like a face-down letter. Abigail took a deep breath, and her hand finally opened the notebook. There were no lists of jewelry, no maps of secrets. There were records of dates, small notes about dinners, books, artworks moved around, and, between one page and the next, loose phrases that felt like notes to himself. "Don't forget what the silence said. What's missing screams. Don't erase the clue you haven't yet understood." She closed the cover slowly. "Why keep what isn't yours?" The question came out before she could calculate the consequences. He wasn't offended. He simply leaned back, as if that were the password he'd been waiting to hear. "Because sometimes what isn't mine is the only thing that still moves me." The answer wasn't about an earring. It was about the emptiness no safe can fill. He sat back down, and dinner continued as if nothing had been said. But every small gesture now carried the inner rumble of a truth touching the surface. At the end, he blew out the flame of one of the candles with a short puff, and the shadow that fell on the wall traced for a few seconds the exact line of the hidden panel in the hallway. "Details irritate me when they're out of alignment," he commented casually, as if citing a habit. A door half out of alignment, a painting a centimeter taller than it should be, a panel that doesn't quite fit the wood. There was a silence that almost hurt. "I imagine you notice these things too." It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. Abigail felt her back touch the chair, as if trying to melt into it. "I've learned to notice what no one else sees," he said, and his tone held firm. He nodded, satisfied with the answer that didn't contradict anything. When he stood, he left the notebook in Abigail's place. "Take it. Read it if you want." She considered refusing, thought about the other employees, thought about what they would say if they saw her crossing the hallway with that object that shouldn't touch her. Still, he took the notebook. As he walked through the door, he added, almost absently, "Some things are returned when they make sense. Before that, they're just pieces waiting for their story." The hallway greeted her with the same gloom as always, but now every inch of wall seemed to breathe beneath the wood. In the distance, she heard the piano repeat that interrupted passage. 3 notes and a silence like a code. And as she walked back to work, the weight of the notebook in her arms and the invisible weight of what he hadn't said finally seemed equal. That night, Abigail placed the notebook on the narrow table in her room, but didn't open it. She simply stared at it like someone staring at a closed door, knowing that once they've walked through it, nothing will ever be the same again. The distant sound of rain hitting the glass seemed to mark a slow beat, pulling at memories she rarely let surface. The earring wasn't just an ornament. It was the last thing her mother had given her before Abigail left her hometown. A silent farewell, marked by the trembling hand that zipped it around her ear while saying, "Take this wherever you go and never forget where you came from." For years, that small golden circle had been more than a piece of metal. It was an anchor, an invisible amulet that kept her connected to a home that had slowly become just a memory. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Abigail closed her eyes and saw again the simple kitchen of her childhood, the smell of fresh bread, the light filtering through the thin curtains. The earring glinted in the reflection of the window as her mother smiled, even through teary eyes. Since then, she had never slept without the earring in her ears, until that day in the mansion. The memory of the moment she had left it on the bed returned with disturbing clarity. It hadn't been a forgetfulness. There was something about her, perhaps an unconscious desire to leave a mark, to provoke a deviation in the millionaire's perfectly controlled world. Perhaps, deep down, she wanted to see how he would react to having something so personal in his territory. But now, knowing that he had kept it, and where, the sensation became more complex. It was no longer just his object. It was a part of her he had chosen to keep. Touching the empty earlobe, she felt a chill that didn't come from the cold. It was as if, with each passing day, the earring became more his than hers. In the early hours of the morning, she woke with the feeling that the room was smaller, as if the walls had moved closer together while she slept. The notebook was still there, intact. And though she had resisted before, now she couldn't anymore. He opened it, flipping through pages of firm handwriting and dates that stretched for years. Among trivial descriptions of events and changes in the house, he found short phrases that seemed out of place, almost poetic. What is hidden requires patience. There are keys that only work when forgotten. What is precious knows how to wait. Reading those words, Abigail sensed that the earring wasn't just kept, it was being waited for. Whatever he saw in that piece wasn't the same as what she saw. For her, it was a root, an origin, a silent promise. For him, perhaps it was a riddle, a reminder, or even a mirror of something he had lost. She closed the notebook slowly, her heart racing. And in that moment, she realized she no longer simply wanted to retrieve the earring. She wanted to know why he had chosen to keep it close, because in some way she didn't yet understand. The answer to that question had the power to change not only what existed between them, but what she believed about herself. The morning after dinner, the house seemed to breathe through cracks. Abigail walked down the longest hallway with the laundry basket propped on her hip, her head still glued to the sentences in her notebook. The paneling in the middle of the hallway, which had previously seemed only millimeters out of line, now pulsed like a secret. The wood had a different sheen, less worn at the edges, as if careful fingers had avoided touching it for years until recently. She approached under the pretense of dusting the baseboard and saw for the first time a subtle cut at the level of the non-existent doorknob. The thin line revealed a shadow darker than the hallway's gloom. She wiped the cloth slowly, as if stroking a skittish animal, and felt the cool breath hidden in the wood. Within, the steel breathed. Late in the afternoon, while changing the flowers on the mirrored console, she tested angles with the silver tray, bringing it closer to the wall under the distracted gaze of someone who only organizes. The polished surface reflected the panel's slanted profile. A slight adjustment of her wrist was enough for the light from the window, reflecting off the silver, to trace the outline of an inner frame through the crack. She didn't see the safe. She saw its promise like a room within a room. Her heart beat in time with the sentences she'd read. What was missing screamed. And now, what was missing in her, the earring, her mother's voice, the root, seemed to scream from behind the metal. Later, alone in the pantry, she opened the notebook and searched for dates, repetitions, any sequence that would help her decipher not a numerical code, but the man behind the safe. On a winter's day years ago, he'd jotted down just 4 words, 3 notes and silence. The same piano fragment she'd heard repeating through the hallways. On another page, a dry entry. April, Friday, 11:07 a.m. Small anchors hidden amidst the banal. It didn't make sense for a combination, but it did make sense for a ritual. He didn't lock things. He kept things in suspense. That night, when everyone had retired, Abigail returned to the hallway under the pretext of checking the blinds. She pressed her ear to the panel and heard nothing, the most tense nothing she had ever heard. She took a step back and measured the room with the eyes of someone who was no longer just an employee. To the right, the mirrored console. To the left, a brass lampshade whose top also reflected like a rounded blade. Ahead, a frame with anti-reflective glass, whose surface, if tilted, could reflect an unlikely angle. She was assembling a light map, a path to see without being seen. The next day, the opportunity almost arose by chance. While lining up books in the library, she heard the dry sound of metal turning somewhere in the hallway, a rhythm she recognized immediately. It wasn't a doorknob. It was numbers. The air changed density, and she moved with the studied slowness of someone who had learned to be invisible. She stopped on the corner, a few steps from the panel, but remained out of sight. In the lamp's reflection, she saw his shoulder, his hand firmly on the disc, the other holding the half-open wooden door. The rest of the hallway seemed to hold its breath. She lifted the tray a few millimeters, enough to capture the image the lamp belatedly returned. An inner steel rim, the curve of the hinge, the muted glow of framed photographs inside. Or were they envelopes? The safe was larger than she'd imagined, not a utilitarian square, but a small sanctuary, organized with the obsession of someone who classifies memories as works of art. She didn't see the earring. She saw contours, volumes, planes, but it was enough for her mind to begin filling in the blanks. She imagined letters with thick paper, necklaces that clashed with his coldness, an old portrait of a woman whose smile had grown sharper in the absence of time, a wedding ring kept not for value but for penance. She imagined her earring lying among things that didn't belong to her, acquiring with each passing day the smell of someone else's guilt. When the inner door closed, the click seemed to cross the hallway like a verdict. He adjusted the panel with the palm of his hand, aligning the wood until the crack once again became a fiction. And for a moment, before returning to his office, he stared at the mirrored console. He didn't see her. He saw only the brief syllable of himself, the precise cut of his tie, the wrinkles that wouldn't go away. That look in his own reflection betrayed someone who, by locking away objects, tried to keep alive what he hadn't known how to save in another time. When the hallway emptied, Abigail pressed the tray to her chest as if holding a shield. The plan was formed without words. She wouldn't tear what was hers by force. She would make the house work for her. The silver, the glass, the afternoon light, the silence that repeated 3 notes and stopped. Everything would be a lens. Everything would be a path. Returning to her room, she touched her empty earlobe and felt the absence like a burn. For the first time, the pain didn't come from having lost the earring. It came from knowing he had found a place, and that place was within him. What if the safe was merely the frame for what he truly hid? The question lingered as the city outside quieted, and the hallway with its perfect line awaited the next imperceptible shift that would shake the entire geometry of the house. The following days were like walking on a suspended wire. Each step Abigail took through the house seemed to echo, and that echo somehow always found his ears. There were no more chance encounters. Everything now seemed choreographed. One day in the library, she climbed the small ladder to reach the books on the highest shelf. She sensed she was not alone, even before she heard the door. The discreet sound of the latch clicking announced his presence. He said nothing, just moved closer, close enough that the height difference between them was almost nullified. Abigail stepped down a step, and for a second, the distance between her hands and his shrank to mere inches. She felt the vibration of the silence more than any words could convey. As she reached the ground, she passed him carrying a book, and their shoulders brushed lightly, not enough to be overt contact, but enough for them both to know it had happened. The next afternoon, their encounter took place in the hallway leading to the smaller room, where the late-day light filtered through the stained glass and scattered golden flecks across the floor. Abigail was carrying a tray of tea, and he appeared on the other side, walking slowly as if calculating each step. When they met, the hallway became too narrow for them to pass without touching. He leaned lightly against the wall, but didn't pull away completely. Her arm brushed against his, and the porcelain on the tray clinked. "Careful," he said, his tone not alert, but almost a murmur of interest. Abigail looked up and met his, fixed, as if to capture the moment with surgical precision. "I know how to balance what is fragile," replied. He let out a brief smile, and the moment dissolved without haste. There were also moments of distance, like when she was cleaning the glass on the console table in the hallway and felt him watching her from the stairs, his eyes scanning every gesture as if searching for flaws or signs. In those moments, Abigail remembered the earring, its physical absence, its invisible weight, and felt like everything they did was a variation of that same game. Calculated approaches, interrupted touches, words that didn't quite say what they meant. Until one morning, she came into his office to leave documents on his desk. He was there, standing, examining a small object in his hand. When he saw her, he clenched his fist, but not quickly enough for her to notice the metallic glint. She couldn't see clearly what it was, but the silhouette seemed dangerously familiar. As she passed him, the air grew thicker. Sometimes the value of something isn't in what it is, but in what it reminds her of. He said without meeting her eyes. Abigail shivered and responded with only a slight nod. As she left, she didn't know if she was more worried about what he had said or what he had hidden in his fist. That night, in his room, he thought about how close they were to crossing a line neither of them would ever be able to retreat from. It wasn't just about the earring. It was about what it symbolized, physical proof that, at some point, their worlds had irreversibly intersected. The hallway was asleep, with the lights dimmed when Abigail decided she would wait no longer for coincidences. She had studied weeks of reflections until she had transformed the house into a mental diagram, the brass of the lampshade as the first mirror, the polished curve of the console table as the second, the glass of the picture tilted by millimeters as the third. At that hour, the millionaire was in his office, the door ajar and the piano silent, as it always was when he needed to think without music. Abigail brought the tray to the exact spot where the lamp's light touched the wood, turned the base with the delicacy of someone adjusting a secret, and the shining blade ran along the wall like a silver needle. The beam found the crack in the panel, crossed the almost invisible line, and bounced onto the console table, which trembled back, revealing the grey and white interior. For the first time, she didn't just see the edge of the steel, she saw the inside. The safe was a smaller room within the house, narrow shelves, velvet dividers, envelopes resting like books, and in the center a shallow surface lined with objects. There was a solitary wedding ring, dull from use, an antique clock stopped at 11:07, a hospital bracelet with the name faded, and a date too legible to be coincidence cut from another life. Framed a photograph, a wooden pier with dark water in the background, and from the back a woman in a simple dress, her hair tied back, gazing at a stormy horizon. Abigail tilted the tray a little more, and the reflection obeyed, revealing details that seemed to breathe. An envelope with the letterhead of a Manhattan law firm, another, more worn, with fingerprints on the edges, as if it had been opened and closed without ever being truly read. A blue satin ribbon, kept as if it were jewelry, and beside it, a small velvet case, black on the outside, worn edges. When the reflection touched the lid, she recognized the shape before she even allowed herself to admit it. The case of a pair of earrings. Her chest tightened. The beam of light ran over the tiny opening and revealed the interior in a flickering image, a single earring resting on the velvet, similar to her own, not identical, but with the same curve of gold that outlined a restrained smile. Beside it, where there would have been room for the second, only emptiness. The tray trembled a millimeter between her fingers. The stopped clock inside the safe measured a time that didn't advance, and somehow she understood that her earring hadn't just been stored, it had been placed in the very place where what's missing is kept. The reflection slid once more, and then the light touched something smaller, leaning against the case. An old newspaper clipping, half-faded, bearing a title she could only half read, "Accident on the Lake." and a date that imperfectly matched the engraving scratched on the back of the photograph. She snuffed out the interpretation before it became the truth, like someone extinguishing a flame to avoid setting the house on fire. Her heart was pounding so loudly it seemed capable of betraying her presence, but the hallway remained silent. Higher up, a shallow box contained handwritten cards. His handwriting, recognizable by the way the letters touched each other, contained short phrases that seemed to belong to the same notebook that now slept in her room. 3 notes and silence. Do not return early. Keep until spoken to. Amid the cards, an almost invisible detail. Abigail had to tilt her wrist further, almost touching the wood with the back of her hand so the light could reach the corner. A small photograph, cut with household scissors, showing a face in profile, the lopsided smile of a very young woman. The earring she wore glinted at the level of her earlobe, not the same model but so close that the resemblance hurt. And yet, what struck her most was not the piece. It was the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the way she tilted her head. For a moment, Abigail felt as if she were looking at herself in a life she hadn't lived. She stepped back an inch, and the beam that held the world together diminished. The interior of the safe became an abstract painting, shadows and gleams without edge. She held her breath, counted to 3, and returned the tray to its innocent serving position, the silver reflecting only silver, the glass giving back only corridor, the panel returning to wall. Her body wanted to run, but her feet obeyed the discipline of someone who had already learned that escape makes noise. She crossed the house with studied calm, carried the tray to the pantry, washed the glasses as if her life depended on not breaking any, and only then did she let her hands tremble, hidden behind a dish towel. What she saw wasn't just an earring lost in an oversized safe. It was an altar. And, like every altar, it had a logic that brooked no intruders. Each object told the same story of an interrupted time. Late that night, in her room, she pressed the notebook to her chest and realized that the sentences that had once seemed like pleas were now instructions. Keep it until he speaks. What was missing from her, the earring, matched what was missing from him. The end of a story he refused to finish. For the first time, Abigail understood that retrieving the piece wouldn't be giving back what was hers. It would be touching a wound he'd chosen to keep open. And even knowing this, she felt the reckless urge to delve deeper. Because inside that safe, between a missing ring finger and a clock that had stopped at the same minute forever, there was something calling her by a name no one in the house ever spoke aloud. The dawn seemed denser than usual, as if the mansion had closed its doors to the air itself. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, the notebook open across her lap, rereading the short sentences like someone trying to extract a map from a handful of rocks. Among the ordinary notes, she found a page, folded in the corner, almost hidden. Unfolding it, he noticed the handwriting was different, less firm, more slanted, with strokes that betrayed haste or nervousness. There were only 2 lines. The earring fell onto the sheet that morning, and just below, the sound was the same. There were no dates, but the words carried a strange familiarity with what had happened weeks before. She felt her skin crawl. That same sound seemed to echo within her. The memory that was forming wasn't hers. It was his. And for some reason, the earring she'd left on the bed had awakened an old noise in him, the replay of a scene that wasn't there for her to see. The pieces began to move in his mind. The photograph in the safe, the woman with her back turned on the dock, the newspaper clipping about the accident at the lake. Perhaps the lost earring wasn't just an object that reminded him of another woman. Perhaps it was the trigger for a memory he hadn't allowed to die. In the days that followed, she began to observe the details with a different lens. At dinner, he would touch the stem of his glass exactly 3 times before drinking. As he crossed the hallway, his fingers glided over the paneling, as if checking to see if the wood still held what it should. One afternoon, while she was changing the flowers in the smaller room, he entered unannounced. He carried a blue-covered book, worn at the edges. "Have you ever been to a pier in winter?" he asked, staring at her. Abigail said no, and he nodded as if he'd expected that answer. The sound of wood under the ice It's like nothing else. When something falls there, the sound gets trapped in the cold. You hear it, but it doesn't go away. He closed the book and placed it on the table, as if the matter were closed. But for her, nothing was. Later, he found a loose leaf inside the notebook, tucked between the pages like a poorly kept secret. It was a letter, written many years ago, the ink already faded. I kept it, because I couldn't return it. Not out of attachment, but because I couldn't bear what it meant to accept that it was the end. There was no signature, but the handwriting was his. And on the fold of the paper, a small drawing of an earring, identical to his own, flanked by a second, as if they were inseparable pairs. One was shaded, the other blank. The revelation came not as a shock, but as a slow, inexorable rising tide. Abigail realized that by putting her earring in the safe, he hadn't simply repeated an old gesture. He had tried to reconstruct something he'd lost. Perhaps a promise, perhaps a love that ended before it could be said goodbye. And if the safe was the mausoleum of his absences, her earring had become the new piece on this altar, occupying the space of a story that didn't belong to him. But now it did. Deep down, she knew there was no way to retrieve the piece without touching that past. And perhaps that was exactly what he feared, that by opening the safe to return it, he would also have to open the memory of someone who could no longer return. The house shrank into a thick silence as the living room clock struck 11:07. Abigail crossed the hallway, as if treading where her own breath might awaken something ancient, placed the closed notebook on the piano top and played 3 short notes. The sound rose unaccompanied and stopped. The office door opened silently. He appeared with the same self-possession as ever, but there was fatigue behind his eyes, the exhaustion of someone who holds the world in check without ever letting it go. He didn't say good night, didn't ask what she was doing there. He simply shifted his gaze to the panel, touched the wood at just the right spot, and let the crack create a space between them. The steel responded with the click that only an entire house recognizes. He removed first the velvet case, then a small box of thick paper tied with a blue satin ribbon. He placed the case on the piano and placed the box in Abigail's hands, as if returning a bird that hadn't learned to fly. "This is yours." The word "your" sounded like something he was still learning to pronounce. Inside the box, the earring gleamed as if it had breathed in the darkness. The same metal, the same curve, the same origin. Abigail closed her fingers around the piece, and for an instant felt the weight of her own history return to the place from which it should never have been torn. But he didn't close the box. He opened the velvet case and revealed the other earring, old, alone, kept in mourning. He stared at it for a moment, as if staring at the sentence that always stopped before the full stop. "That morning, the noise was the same," he said, without raising his head. "On the sheet, then, on the dock." The rest came in images that needed no words. Wet wood, dark water, a clock stopping at the same minute, no one to bring it back. He closed the case carefully, as if closing the wound, and only then did he look at Abigail. There had been no request, no promise, just the belated honesty of someone who understands that control is a way of losing. "If I return what isn't mine," he asked in a whisper, "what do I do with what's left?" Abigail took a deep breath, and with a calm she hadn't known she possessed, took the other earring, the one she'd always kept, from her apron pocket and held it up to his face. "You let go of what doesn't come back," she replied, "and keep, not in a safe, but in your body. What you learn from it." She fastened the earring to her ear, feeling the clasp click into place like a final cog. The gesture was simple, but the mansion seemed to reposition itself around him. He lowered his eyes, nodded, and led her through the empty kitchen to the back door. The early morning air was scratchy against his skin. The lawn stretched, damp, to the edge of the lake, reflecting the distant city lights. They walked side by side across the wooden deck, where an ancient creaking tree still lived among the boards. When they stopped, he opened the velvet case for the last time. The antique earring rested there with the impossible lightness of things too heavy. "I kept it so as not to accept the end," he confessed, and the phrase, "upon meeting the water," found no echo. The clock on his phone struck 11 again, as if the minute had chosen to repeat itself to finally pass. He closed his fingers over the piece, inhaled, and threw it in a short, perfect arc. The sound wasn't a snap of metal. It was the brief touch of something finally surrendering. Small waves opened, slowly dissolving the image of the sky. They stared until the surface became a mirror again. There the past ceased to be a locked room. They returned to the house unhurriedly. In the hallway he stopped before the panel, now rigorously aligned, and touched it only to feel the wood, not to open it. 3 notes and silence, he murmured. But this time he added the 4th, lightly. Almost a smile that the entire house couldn't name. On the piano his fingers searched for the melody that had been interrupted for years, and when the 4th note came, there was no triumph or spectacle. There was humble relief, the music accepting its arrival where it had always avoided. Abigail left the notebook on its closed lid. With a fine pen, she wrote on the first blank page, "Keep until spoken to, spoken." He read without picking up the notebook, as if respecting what doesn't belong to him, and accompanied her to the stairs. No one moved, no one promised anything. The next day, when the sun streaked the marble again, she found, precisely in the folded center of her uniform, the blue satin ribbon tied in a simple bow. There was no note. There was a choice. She tucked the ribbon inside her purse and, before putting on her apron, slipped on the 2 earrings as if completing a circle. As she passed through the hallway, she noticed a millimeter-square painting out of alignment and straightened it with her fingers, a habit she had learned from her home. In the office he adjusted papers, less rigid, less shielded, as if each object had regained its right to be just an object. They stared at each other for a moment to cherish. She moved on. He returned to the piano. The safe remained locked all day, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Karma didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with the most precious gesture he could make: return. And in that return, what was? Hers began to pulse in its rightful place, and what was his stopped asking for a lock. That night, when the house slept, the lake was empty of debris, only water, and the mansion, for the first time in a long time, breathed fully. The day dawned grey, with low clouds that seemed to brush the mansion's roof. Abigail crossed the hallway with measured steps, not because of the weight of her work, but because of the feeling that each movement led her to an inevitable endpoint. The panel was there, perfectly aligned, as if nothing in it could give way. And yet she knew that behind that intact geometry, a secret breathed. In the study, he stood at the window, looking out at the damp garden, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she entered, but his voice broke the silence with the precision of someone who knew it would be heard. "What's yours must return to you." The sentence hung in the air, unhurried. He approached, walked past her, and without hesitation, touched the wood panel. The safe responded with its usual deep click, revealing the interior like a private room that opens only once. Abigail held her breath. He removed the black velvet case and placed it on the table. When the lid opened, the earring gleamed as if time had polished it. She held out her hand, and he didn't just allow it. He gently pushed the case toward her, as if completing a long-delayed delivery. Abigail took the piece, feeling the cool metal slowly warm against her skin. It wasn't just the return of an object. It was the closing of a cycle she hadn't even known she was experiencing when she entered that house. Before she could thank him, he removed the other case from a higher shelf, the one she'd seen in the reflection, holding the old earring. She stared inside for long seconds until the distant sound of wind against the windows seemed to fill the space. "This has never been paired with anything again," he said, almost in a whisper. He closed the lid and held it firmly in his hand, as if the decision had already been made before they even began speaking. Without warning, he walked to the back door and gestured for her to follow him. The lawn was sodden, the smell of wet earth mingling with the chill in the air. They walked to the edge of the lake, where the wooden deck creaked under the weight of each step. Abigail watched him hold the case like someone holding a weight too old to carry another day. "I kept it because I couldn't bear to lose it again. But keeping It was a worse way to lose it. The sentence, though spoken to her, seemed to be addressed to himself. With a restrained movement, he opened the lid and, in an unceremonious gesture, dropped the earring into the water. The sound was brief, almost imperceptible, but it echoed in her like the end of a song that needed no applause. They stood there, watching the small waves dissipate the last physical evidence of a past he had decided to release. When they returned, the mansion seemed different. No, less imposing, but less rigid, as if it had given a few millimeters to accommodate the air. In the hallway, he passed the panel without touching it, and Abigail realized that perfect alignment no longer seemed an obligation, but merely a detail. In her room, she put the earring back in her ear, feeling the zipper fasten with a barely audible click. Looking in the mirror, she didn't just see the recovered piece. She saw herself whole, with the root she had always carried back in place. That night, as he crossed the hallway to close the curtains, he noticed a painting slightly out of plumb. Reflexively, he straightened it with his fingertips, repeating the gesture he had learned from observing it. And he understood that true return lay not in the golden metal but in what it signified, the freedom to carry what is yours without having to keep it locked away. Karma had been fulfilled silently, without revenge or spectacle, only with the precise return of all that had once been taken. If this story touched you, just imagine what awaits you in the next chapter. Subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss it, and tell me in the comments, if it were you, would you have returned the earring or left it in the safe? Your answer could change the course of the next story.